Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So there has been some big events over the past 2 days. Ontario Line has been approved by the city along with the rest of the provincial transit plan. Union Station is getting a big rebuild on the south side. We're going to tell you all about it. So before we get into the stories for today, I just want to deal with a few logistical details. If you haven't already, we released a video a couple days ago about sending us transit cards. Definitely go check that out. We have a PO box now, so we'll probably start putting that PO box in our description. But yeah, send us your transit cards and maybe anything else of interest like transit maps and stuff. We'd super love to have them, especially if they're from exotic sort of locations like Europe and Asia. Anyways, beyond that, if you're not already, consider following us on Instagram and Twitter and supporting us on Patreon. Have to give a big shout out to all our patrons because they definitely help us do what we do, and they're also kind of collaborators with us sometimes on our videos. Anyways, on to today's main topics. So before I get into the Ontario Line stuff, I don't want to miss the important news that came out yesterday about Union Station. It was mainly overlooked by pretty much all the news media, and that is kind of the unfortunate state of the news media and their coverage of transit in Toronto. They love covering the politics, not so much any kind of real awesome progress that's happening right under our noses. It's unfortunate, but fortunately we're here to tell you guys all about these projects. So on the south side of Union Station, Metrolinx has just announced that they're looking for basically builders to construct two very wide platforms, both of which are expected to be islands. Perhaps one will just be a side platform, but there should be at least 3 tracks getting new wide platforms. When I say wide, I mean around 6+ meters wide, so significantly wider than the existing platforms at Union, which if you've seen them, they're not very wide and they're very curvy, not straight. Trains can't go through them very fast. They're not ideal, and they're definitely not up to the standards of rapid transit, which Go RER is basically going to be turning Go into, so these new platforms are pretty critical. Also, kind of something that was wrapped in there is that this is kind of the first phase of this project. In the RER business case, Metrolinx basically discussed that they want to rebuild most of the platforms at Union Station. Essentially what you're going to have is you're going to have several really wide islands, like the ones that are being proposed for the south side of the station. Well, actually, not being proposed, being tendered out to a company to build them. You're going to have several sets of these kind of wide island platforms which will serve the frequent services. Ideally, they'll also be fixed, which means that your Lakeshore West or Lakeshore East or Stouffville Line platform will always be the same, kind of like on a subway system. That would be excellent because it would just mean you can just go to your platform and wait, and your train will show up ideally quite quickly, just a more rapid transit-like experience. The rest of the platforms would be a mix of bay platforms, which are essentially dead-end platforms. Some of these would serve the Up Express and kind of traditional GO train lines like Richmond Hill and Milton, which aren't getting RER service, and so they'll still be operating some sort of diesel trains. Some would also serve VIA, and there would still be a few pass-through regular platforms, kind of like what we have today, though ideally with a bit more enhancement. So the great thing about this project, beyond the fact that it will enhance the South Concourse, which is where platforms 27, 26, 25, and 24 are right now, beyond the fact that that area of the station is really not looking so nice now that York and Bay have been rebuilt. That section is kind of, just raw concrete. It's kind of dirty. It's not very nice. It's not very organized. It's congested. It will be nice to open that up, more space, more vertical access. That being said, as some people have pointed out, it's really unfortunate that when the city and Metrolinx were rebuilding Union Station, that Go couldn't have kind of come out and said, yeah, maybe we should reconfigure these platforms, thinking ahead into the future. Supposedly, the city asked Go if they had any plans. They said no, and then a few months after things had got underway, RER kind of as a thing started to develop. And so it's unfortunate that we're going to probably have to rejig a lot of things. As you've noticed, the vertical access on the platforms that are accessible from the York Concourse sucks. They're basically quite narrow staircases. Some of them have these switchbacks, and once you're up on the platforms, there's very little room on either side of those staircases. it's just not very nice. It reminds me a lot of Bloor at Bloor Young, on basically the Bloor Line platform. That's an island. It's congested. You don't feel very safe. It's just not a good experience. So that's kind of the issue we see with the current concourse. Nonetheless, the South Concourse will include, as I said, a full rebuild of kind of the underside of that. There should be way better vertical access, so we'd be hoping for at least escalators on every platform, ideally multiple on every platform, ideally up and down escalators. Provisions in the design include the ability to do level boarding, which is absolutely excellent. That was something that was discussed when Phil Verster first came to Metrolinx, but it's exciting to see that that's now something that looks like it's actually on the horizon. Level boarding would speed up egress and as well as getting onto the GO trains, and it would make every car accessible. So it's definitely an awesome thing to aim for. And again, that would make it feel a bit more like rapid transit versus today where you kind of got to step up a few steps to get into the GO train. The final kind of great benefit of having these two southern platforms, which would be relatively high capacity given they're going to have lots of space on them and they're going to have lots of vertical access, is that they can be kind of the first platforms that will serve RER. If you know about what trains currently serve those platforms, a lot of Lakeshore East and Stova Line trains serve them. Lakeshore East looks to be the first line to get RER because it has the Whitby maintenance facility, which is kind of electrification ready. And the beauty of this is that it's also going to be designed to be totally electrification ready. The rest of Union is going to require quite a bit of adjustment to basically have electrification pushed into it. This kind of southern set of platforms is going to be literally designed from the ground up to feature the necessary poles for catenary, the gantries, and all that sort of thing, which means that the first RER services will likely use these platforms, and then as the other platforms are adjusted, more RER services will kind of shift to those other platforms. Anyways, that's what's going on at Union Station. Super exciting and something that was not in the news at all. The next big piece of news is that the City of Toronto essentially threw their support behind the Ontario Line, Scarborough Subway Extension, Eglinton West Subway Extension, and Yonge North Subway Extension projects. Now, there's a lot to kind of quickly unpack about what I think the state of all these projects is, but there's a few things I want to get across to start with. First of all, if you watch the hearings, they're incredibly, full of politics, as expected, because these are political meetings. That being said, it's kind of crazy how people are just blind to what an actual plan is based on who's proposing it. If it's the guy in the other party or who has opposing political views, you just can't even imagine that this could be a good plan. And it's unfortunate that there's still a few people who are holding out and not kind of acknowledging that this is a superior plan to the relief line as it was proposed by the city. Beyond the fact that because of the technology and because going elevated makes construction significantly simpler in some areas, you also have the fact that this line just extends to more places. And actually, I think the western extension is something that is so deeply underappreciated. Beyond serving kind of a super hot growing area around Queen and Spadina, as well as east of Liberty Village and south of Liberty Village, it also connects to Exhibition and East Harbour in the east. What I can imagine happening in the future is kind of similar to some large cities in Europe and Asia. East Harbour and Exhibition can kind of become emergency termini or extra termini stations for the city. It could be as simple as, oh, this Lakeshore West train will just terminate at Exhibition because Union, there's something going on or something like that, and then people can just hop on the Ontario line and take that into the core of the city. It just opens up more opportunities for access, and it means that, for example, if Union Station becomes overcrowded, which I'm sure eventually it will with all the new service we want to put into it, that we'll have a few more options to the east and to the west, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So beyond that, the line also extends to the north. Now yes, the city had proposed a relief line north, and again, there had long been plans for some sort of line up north towards Don Mills, Eglinton, Shepherd. The thing is though, that the relief line plan as it was being sent to the federal government and the province was just the southern section. And to get the northern section to the point where it was ready to be sent off and where there was enough kind of political willpower behind it, it could likely have taken a long time. Look at how long the relief line south took to get people's weight behind it. I just imagine that if they didn't end up being one project, what you would end up having is a relief line south and then just a ton of delays, and you have to get things spinning, you need to do environmental assessment, all these different things to build that northern section. And the fact that it's happening all as one project, I think is fundamentally very important. And that's the main differentiating factor I see. Also though, the fact that the trains are automated has a lot of benefits. Yes, you could use Toronto Rocket trains and make them automated and do all this, but the thing about the Toronto subway trains is that they were designed for the Toronto subway. As Metrolinx says in the Ontario Line business case, the ability to use kind of generic, if we can call them that, metro trains means that you can just have a lot of the innovations that other cities are enjoying because you're not kind of limited by this view of what the TTC subway is. As well, unlike the subway, the cars can use a lighter construction. Now, by no means are they small. The actual subway cars will be similar size to the Toronto subway cars. The trains will just be around 5 cars long instead of 6 cars long. And since each train will be each car will be a few meters shorter, the overall train length is definitely shorter. But since the trains are automated and since they will likely have a much better seating arrangement, since they will be generic kind of metro cars as used in other cities, the capacity will still be quite high. In fact, the announced capacity according to the TTC today will be up to 34,000 people per direction per hour, which is higher than the Yonge line is at today. So for people complaining that perhaps the Ontario line will not have enough capacity, well, it doesn't seem like that's going to be a problem for the immediate future. Now, of course, the city also said the Yonge line is going to be overcrowded again by 2041. But that's not really surprising to anyone because there's just a ton of development going on around Yonge. The relief line is going to relieve bus passengers coming in to Yonge, but as I said in a previous video, people who live on Yonge are not going to go over east to get to the Ontario line to go south. So, how do we solve that? Well, something I've proposed before is a couple adjustments you could make to the Yonge line to increase its capacity. As we said today, that the Yonge line with full ATC and platform screen doors and such could get up to a lot more capacity, up to around 45,000 people per direction per hour. And then you could also supplement it with BRT express buses on Yonge Street, which I think is a really good use of that space. And then perhaps add bike lanes, better pedestrian infrastructure, and limit the use to cars. There are lots of other north-south arterials in the city, and so Yonge being such an important transit arterial already because of the subway's location there, it makes sense as a street to prioritize transit on. Now, to quickly talk about the other projects, I think the Scarborough subway extension is unfortunate, as I've said in a previous video. I think that upgrading the SRT makes a lot more sense. That being said, a 2-year delay or so to have 3 stations versus 1, to me, I don't see a huge negative there. If you guys don't already know, I kind of live on the east side of Toronto, and so I actually experience using Line 2 and the bus service in Scarborough all the time. And to be honest, I'm just not sure that it's that big of a deal if the subway is delayed a little bit longer. The bus service is actually quite good in Scarborough, and while it will be inconvenient for some people who are taking the SRT, overall I think it's something that people will be able to live with. Now on Yonge North, the project basically didn't come up in City Council meeting at all, and I think that's largely because no one really has a problem with it. As long as it's built, once the Ontario line is online and there's a sufficient relief to Line 1, Yonge North subway extension just makes a lot of sense. No one's debating it. Finally, Eglinton West. This is another one that's surprisingly quite contentious. Now, the province did decide to put it underground, and that's something that I think a lot of people would disagree with, including myself. I don't think that putting it underground makes a ton of sense. You have a right-of-way, in fact, along much of the road. You should use that and just build the line elevated. But as we know, Toronto hates elevated. And to be fair, the line where the Ontario line is going to be above ground is in existing rail corridors and in some kind of high density areas, so perhaps it's a little easier to argue for elevated there. That being said, I do think the Eglinton West extension should be elevated, but I don't think it should be at grade. You do have to consider the fact that some of the studies, if you look into them for the Eglinton West LRT, are pretty fishy. They talk about things like people being highly discouraged from riding the line because they would have to go down a set of stairs or an escalator to get to the station and things along those lines. And when I see that sort of language in studies, I often think, well, who commissioned these studies? The city? And what did the city at the time of commissioning the studies largely favor? An at-grade LRT. So you kind of have to take studies like that with a grain of salt, especially when they're not quantitative. They're just how people feel about things and what they think that maybe people's opinion will mean that they don't want to ride a train if it's above or below ground. Studies like that don't tend to be consistent and they have a lot of issues, so I'm not super trusting of them. Anyways, I'm happy that the city, along with a little bit of consternation, approved the plan and basically said we're gonna throw our weight behind it. That means that all three levels of government are basically aligned, and now I just hope that they can figure out a way to build this stuff super fast. We need the relief today, but we'll see it in a few years. It only adds to the incredible number of projects going on in Toronto. It's exciting. I'll be making many more videos on them, but I wanted to update you guys. Thanks for watching the video today, and as always, have a good night.